The Western Roman Empire fell in less than 100 years. How did the East survive 1,000? The Byzantine Empire faced constant existential threats from Persians, Arabs, Turks, and even fellow Christians on crusade. Yet it outlasted its rivals by centuries, clinging to life long after its Western partner crumbled. The secret was neither a single battle nor a brilliant emperor. It was a recurring strategic logic the Byzantines mastered, a flexible, resourceful approach that prioritized survival over conquest. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that strategy was, how it worked, and why it allowed a beleaguered remnant to endure while more aggressive powers rose and fell. What does it take to outlast every enemy without ever fighting a war you do not have to? Constantinople sat at the crossroads of continents, a city built for survival. Its founder, Constantine the Great, chose the site with the eye of a military strategist. The city perched on a triangular peninsula, guarded on two sides by the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn, a deep natural harbor. A massive chain could be drawn across its entrance to block enemy ships. On the land side, a single wall stretched from sea to sea, a line of defense that would be thickened and raised over centuries until it became the most formidable fortification of the medieval world. But geography was only half the story. While the Western Roman Empire struggled with a crumbling economy, shrinking tax bases, and endless barbarian invasions along a long land border, the East enjoyed a very different fate. The eastern provinces were rich in grain, gold, and trade goods. Silk, spices, and precious metals flowed through Constantinople from Persia, India, and China. This wealth funded a professional army, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and a legal system that kept Roman law alive. The Eastern Empire inherited the full administrative machinery of Rome, but it also inherited something less tangible, a habit of strategic thinking that had made Rome great. At first, the Byzantines applied this thinking in conventional ways. They fought set-piece battles, they launched counterattacks, they tried to reclaim lost territory. But the geography that protected them also constrained them. They could not afford to lose armies in reckless adventures. So slowly, almost imperceptibly, a different logic began to take shape, one that would turn their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. How did a civilization that could not afford to fight like Rome learn to survive longer than Rome ever did? The answer to that question lies in a single concept, one that historians call the strategic economy of force. It sounds like jargon, but its meaning is simple and elegant. The Byzantines learned to achieve security at the lowest possible cost, using every tool in their arsenal before ever reaching for a sword. They did not invent this strategy all at once. It emerged over generations, shaped by hard lessons and narrow escapes. At its heart, the strategic economy of force was a flexible mindset, not a rigid set of rules. It meant that when an enemy appeared on the horizon, the first response was never to rush an army into the field. Instead, the emperor and his advisors would ask a series of careful questions. Could we negotiate? Could we pay them off with gold, which is cheaper than a war? Could we stir up trouble among their rivals, distracting them with a threat closer to home? Could we gather intelligence from merchants or spies to discover their true intentions? Only when diplomacy, bribery, and deception failed would they resort to military action. And even then, that action was usually limited and precise: a raid to burn a harvest, a show of force along a border, a defensive campaign designed to make the cost of invasion too high. The goal was not to crush the enemy utterly, but to convince them that attacking Byzantium was simply not worth the trouble. This approach prioritized long-term stability over short-term glory. The Byzantines understood that every territorial gain came with a price tag: forts to garrison, roads to patrol, local populations to pacify. They learned to ask themselves a brutally honest question, one that many empires never considered. Do we really need this land, or can we achieve the same security by making it a neutral buffer zone? By refusing to chase the dream of reconquering their lost Roman provinces, they saved the resources needed to keep their core alive. Over time, this habit of thinking became second nature, embedded in their diplomacy, their military planning, even their religious outreach. It was the quiet engine that kept Constantinople standing long after other kingdoms had fallen. And it took shape through a series of specific tactics, each one a lesson in how to do more with less. Diplomacy was their most powerful weapon, and they wielded it with a skill that made other empires look like amateurs. Before any army marched, before a single arrow was fired, the Byzantines had already begun their offensive, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet chambers of royal courts and the whispered conversations of distant bazaars. They understood that the cheapest victory was the one that never had to be fought at all. To achieve this, they built an entire system of influence that surrounded Constantinople like a web. The first thread of this web was the marriage alliance. When a threatening neighbor rose to power, the Byzantines would offer a bride from the imperial family, a princess whose dowry was not gold but a promise of friendship. This was not a simple wedding. It was a strategic bond that turned a potential enemy into a relative, someone with a stake in the empire's survival. A king who married a Byzantine princess gained prestige, but he also gained a formal obligation to think twice before raiding Roman land. It was a subtle leash, but it held. Over the centuries, dozens of foreign rulers became sons-in-law to the emperor, bound by family ties that softened the sharp edges of rivalry. Even more direct was the practice of hostage exchanges. When a particularly aggressive leader needed taming, the Byzantines would request his children or close relatives as guests in Constantinople. These were not prisoners in chains. They were raised in the imperial palace, educated in Greek, taught to admire Roman culture, and shown the splendor of the city. When they eventually returned home, they carried with them a deep personal connection to the empire, and often a reluctance to attack the place they had come to see as a second home. It was a long-term investment in loyalty, and it paid dividends for generations. But not every threat could be neutralized with family ties. Some enemies were too distant or too proud to accept marriage or hostages. For them, the Byzantines had another tool, one that spoke a universal language: gold. Tribute payments were not a sign of weakness in their eyes, but a calculated expense. They would calculate the cost of a war, the lives lost, the crops burned, the trade disrupted, and then compare it to the cost of simply paying the barbarian chieftain a yearly sum. More often than not, the numbers favored payment. The emperor would send gold, fine silks, or ceremonial gifts, and in return, the chieftain would promise peace. This was not surrender, it was a business transaction. The enemy got wealth, and Constantinople got time to rebuild its treasury and prepare its defenses. And when the tribute grew too expensive, the Byzantines would simply stop paying and let the conflict begin on their own terms. Yet the most elegant part of their diplomatic arsenal was their ability to sow discord among rivals. They cultivated a vast network of spies and informants who traveled along trade routes, listening to rumors, identifying feuds, and finding leverage. When two enemy tribes appeared ready to unite against the empire, Byzantine agents would stir old grievances, spread whispers of betrayal, or secretly arm one side against the other. They would pit a Persian king against his own nobles or encourage a Bulgar leader to distrust his own chieftains. It was like playing chess on a board of nations, moving pieces not with armies but with secrets. The beauty of this strategy was that it cost almost nothing compared to a war. A handful of gold coins sent to the right hands could keep two enemy armies fighting each other for years, leaving Constantinople safe and untouched. All of this created a network of client kingdoms that surrounded the empire like a buffer zone. These were not directly ruled by Constantinople, but they were bound by treaties, gifts, and the constant pressure of Byzantine influence. They served as early warning systems. If a great power like the Sassanid Persians or the Arab caliphates prepared a massive invasion, these client states would send word ahead, giving the emperor precious months to prepare. And if a client king grew too independent, the Byzantines had ways of reminding him of his obligations: a sudden reduction in gifts, a hint of support for his rival, or a discreet word to his ambitious brother. This diplomatic offensive was a masterclass in resourcefulness. It turned the empire's weakness into a strength. Because they could not afford endless wars, they learned to win without fighting. Because they had wealth, they used it as a tool of influence. Because they understood human nature, they exploited pride, fear, and greed to keep their enemies divided. And all the while, Constantinople remained a gleaming prize just out of reach, protected not only by its walls but by the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that the Byzantines had woven around themselves. But diplomacy could only go so far. There would always be enemies who could not be bribed, soothed, or distracted. And when those enemies finally knocked at the gates, the empire needed another kind of strategy, one that turned patience itself into a weapon. That strategy would prove just as effective and just as clever as the art of the diplomatic offensive. Knowledge was the sharpest edge of the Byzantine diplomatic machine, and they built a dedicated institution to forge it. In the heart of Constantinople, inside the sprawling Great Palace, there existed an office that historians later named the Bureau of Barbarians. Its real title was more mundane, but its purpose was extraordinary. This small, quiet department was responsible for collecting, analyzing, and acting on information about every people who lived beyond the empire's borders. Its staff did not simply file reports. They studied the customs, the ambitions, the alliances, and the feuds of distant tribes and kingdoms. They knew which chieftain was nursing a grudge against his brother, which king was desperate for grain after a poor harvest, and which general was plotting against his emperor. This intelligence was the lifeblood of Byzantine strategy, and it flowed from a network of sources that spanned continents. The most obvious collectors of information were the official ambassadors and traveling dignitaries that the empire sent to foreign courts. These men were trained observers. They noted troop movements, the condition of roads, the mood of the nobility, and the strength of fortifications. But their movements were often restricted and their conversations guarded. The truly valuable intelligence came from less formal channels. Merchants, for instance, were the eyes and ears of the empire. They traveled freely, buying and selling in markets from the Caspian Sea to the Atlantic coast. They heard gossip in caravan stops and observed the preparations of armies as they passed. When they returned to Constantinople, they were quietly debriefed by bureau officials who knew exactly what questions to ask. A merchant might mention that he had seen unusually large herds of horses being gathered on the steppes, a detail that, to a trained analyst, signaled an impending raid. Or he might report that a certain tribe had stopped trading in a certain product, indicating a shift in political loyalty. These fragments of information, pieced together, painted a picture of the world beyond the walls. Missionaries were another crucial source. The Byzantine Church was deeply invested in spreading Christianity among pagan peoples, and those missionaries traveled far into hostile lands. They learned languages, lived among foreign communities, and gained intimate knowledge of local power structures. Their letters back to Constantinople were filled with observations that went far beyond theology. They described the number of warriors a chief could muster, the condition of his fortresses, and the alliances he was forming. The Bureau received these reports with the same seriousness as any military dispatch. Even ordinary travelers and pilgrims were debriefed when they passed through the empire's border posts. the Byzantines understood that no scrap of information was too small. A rumor whispered in a tavern in Baghdad could save a city on the Anatolian frontier. This constant flow of intelligence allowed Byzantine leaders to act before a threat materialized. When a report arrived that a Persian army was gathering at the border, the emperor did not wait for the invasion to begin. He would send a diplomatic mission laden with gifts, or order a preemptive raid to burn the enemy's supply depots, or quietly bribe a rival chieftain to attack the Persian rear. More often than not, the invasion never came. The enemy found his plans compromised, his allies suborned, and his campaign sabotaged before it could start. The intelligence apparatus turned the empire into a spider at the center of a vast web. Every tremor along the strands told a story, and the spider always knew where the fly was stirring. The Bureau of Barbarians was not perfect. It suffered from the same flaws as any human institution: rivalry, corruption, and the occasional catastrophic misjudgment. But on the whole, it gave the Byzantine Empire an edge that no amount of gold or steel could match. It was the reason why a state that could barely field a large army could still outmaneuver empires that dwarfed it in manpower. The secret was not in how many soldiers they had, but in how much they knew before the swords were drawn. And this knowledge did not only shape their diplomacy. It also shaped the way they fought when fighting became unavoidable, with a precision that turned battles into surgical instruments of policy. While diplomacy and intelligence formed the outer layers of Byzantium's survival strategy, a quiet revolution in military organization provided its deepest foundation. That revolution was the theme system, and it transformed how the empire defended itself from the inside out. In the old Roman model, provinces were governed by civilian officials, and armies were stationed far from home, paid from the imperial treasury, and supplied by a vast logistical network. But as the empire shrank and the treasury grew strained, that system became unsustainable. The themes replaced it with something far more practical and enduring. Imagine a province that was also a military district, a region where the governor was also a general, and where every farmer knew that his plot of land came with a duty to fight. That was the essence of the theme system. Land was granted to soldiers and their families in exchange for hereditary military service. These soldier farmers, called stratiotai, held their land not as private property but as a benefice tied to their obligation to defend the province. When a local raid threatened, they did not wait for orders from Constantinople. They grabbed their spears, mounted their horses if they could afford them, and rallied under their local commander. They knew the terrain intimately, the passes, the fords, the hidden valleys. They could move quickly and strike hard without requiring a single coin from the central treasury for their daily upkeep. This decentralized defense had profound effects. First, it made the empire far more resilient against the kind of lightning raids that had devastated the western provinces. A band of Arab or Bulgar raiders might sweep across the border, but within days, the local theme army would be on their trail, harassing their flanks, cutting off their retreat, and denying them supplies. The raiders could not simply burn and loot at will. Every village was part of a network of alert defenders who had a personal stake in protecting their homes. Second, the theme system drastically reduced the empire's military budget. The central government no longer had to pay, feed, and equip large standing armies spread across the borders. Instead, those costs were borne by the land itself, by the families who worked it and in turn owed service. The treasury was freed to focus on what it did best, funding diplomacy, maintaining the elite field army based near Constantinople, and keeping the bureaucratic machinery running smoothly. That elite field army, known as the Tagmata, was a small but highly professional force stationed in and around the capital. It served as a strategic reserve, ready to be dispatched to any frontier where a local theme army was overwhelmed. But because the themes handled most local threats, the Tagmata could be kept at a manageable size, well-equipped and well-trained without draining the empire's finances. It was a perfect balance, a network of local guardians who defended their own ground for free, and a core of professional soldiers who could tip the scale when necessary. The theme system did not appear overnight. It evolved gradually from the 7th century onward, as the empire adapted to the loss of its richest provinces and the rise of Islam. But once it was in place, it became the backbone of Byzantine survival for centuries. It allowed a state that could barely afford a large professional army to field an effective defense across thousands of miles of frontier. And it gave the empire something even more valuable than soldiers: time. Time to rebuild, time to negotiate, and time to wait for its enemies to wear themselves out. With this foundation secure, the Byzantines could turn their attention to the art of war itself, fighting not for glory but for survival, and doing so with a precision that made every soldier count. That precision was most visible in the Tagmata, the small but elite core of the Byzantine military. Unlike the theme armies, which were part-time farmer soldiers spread across the provinces, the Tagmata were full-time professionals stationed in and around Constantinople. They were the emperor's personal strike force, a mobile reserve that could be rushed to any frontier where the local defenders needed reinforcement. The Tagmata were composed of heavily armed cavalry and infantry, drilled in complex battlefield maneuvers and equipped with the best armor and weapons the imperial arsenals could produce. They were the tip of the spear, but they were also deliberately small. Maintaining a large standing army was expensive, and the Byzantine treasury had learned to be frugal. So instead of trying to match enemy numbers, the Tagmata focused on quality, discipline, and rapid response. A single well-timed charge by 1,000 Tagmata horsemen could break an invading army that outnumbered them 10-1 if the terrain and timing were right. The emperors relied on these troops to enforce their will, put down rebellions, and deliver the decisive blow in major campaigns, but even the Tagmata had limits. They could not be everywhere at once, and they were too precious to waste in the kind of grinding frontier skirmishes that happened year after year. That is where another class of soldiers entered the picture, one that came from far beyond the empire's borders. The Byzantines were pragmatic above all else, and they saw foreign mercenaries not as a weakness but as a tool. Over the centuries, they employed warriors from almost every people they encountered. Franks from the west known for their heavy cavalry, steppe nomads like the Pechenegs and Cumans for their superb horse archers, and most famously, the Varangians from Scandinavia and later the British Isles. These Varangians served as the emperor's personal bodyguard, a fearsome unit of axe-wielding men whose loyalty was bought with gold and the promise of adventure. The logic was brutally simple. Hiring a mercenary cost gold, but training and equipping a Byzantine soldier cost gold too, and that soldier was a citizen whose death represented a loss to the empire. A foreign mercenary, by contrast, was expendable. If he fell in battle, his home kingdom lost a warrior, not Constantinople. The empire could use these hired swords for the most dangerous tasks, the vanguard of an assault, the rearguard of a retreat, the dirty work of siege warfare, while preserving its own native troops for the campaigns that really mattered. This was not a sign of decay, at least not at first. It was a calculated choice, a way to stretch the empire's military power without draining its population. But every tool has a hidden cost. The reliance on mercenaries created a dangerous dependence over time. When the treasury ran low, the mercenaries did not vanish quietly. They mutinied, switched sides, or simply left, leaving the empire defenseless at critical moments. Worse, mercenaries had no loyalty to the land they defended. They would burn crops and pillage villages as readily as any enemy if they were not paid on time. The Byzantine system remained strong as long as the gold flowed. but it also made the empire's survival hinge on the health of its economy. And as the centuries wore on, that economy would face pressures that no amount of strategic genius could fully manage. The Tagmata and the Mercenaries together formed a dual system, one rooted in native professionalism, the other in foreign opportunism. For a long time, it worked brilliantly, but it also planted the seeds of a vulnerability that later enemies would learn to exploit, turning the empire's greatest strength into a fragile dependency that could be broken with a single well-aimed blow. Orthodox Christianity was the empire's invisible wall. It held together a diverse population from the Balkans to Anatolia, people who spoke different languages and came from different tribes but who all crossed themselves in the same way. The Church gave them a common identity stronger than any law. When a peasant in Greece and a farmer in Cappadocia prayed to the same icons and observed the same feasts, they thought of themselves as Romans, as members of a single community chosen by God. That internal unity was a source of resilience that no external enemy could easily break. But the faith did not stop at the border. It was also a diplomatic instrument of extraordinary reach. The Byzantines saw religious conversion not as a charitable act but as a strategic investment. When they sent missionaries beyond their frontiers, those missionaries carried more than the gospel. They carried Byzantine culture, Byzantine political ideas, and Byzantine loyalty. The most dramatic example of this was the conversion of the Slavic peoples, especially the Bulgars and the Rus. In the 9th century, Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius created a written alphabet for the Slavic languages, allowing the liturgy to be translated. This was not only a gift of literacy but a statement that the new Christians did not have to adopt Latin or Greek. They could worship in their own tongue, a masterstroke that made the Byzantine version of Christianity more accessible and more appealing than the rival church in Rome. The conversion of the Rus was a turning point. When Prince Vladimir of Kiev chose Orthodox Christianity in 988, he did not make a purely spiritual decision. He married the Byzantine emperor's sister. He accepted baptism from Constantinople. He tied his growing state to the empire's religious and political orbit. From that moment on, the Rus considered themselves allies, even protectors of their fellow Orthodox Christians. Trade flourished, military alliances formed, and for centuries, the Rus attacked Constantinople only rarely and reluctantly. A single conversion had pacified what might have become a mortal threat. At home, the Patriarch of Constantinople wielded immense influence. He was the spiritual leader of Orthodox Christianity, second only to the emperor in authority. His most important function was to crown each new emperor in a ceremony that blended Roman tradition with sacred ritual. That coronation was not a formality. It was the moment when a mortal man became God's chosen ruler on earth. Without the Patriarch's blessing, a usurper was just a warlord with a claim. With it, he was the legitimate emperor, anointed by heaven itself. This gave the Church a powerful check on imperial power, but it also gave the emperor an unshakable foundation. Every rebellion was not only treason against the state but sin against God. The ideology of divine right made the throne far more stable than any purely secular monarchy. Missions continued for centuries. Monks traveled north into the forests of Russia, west into the mountains of Serbia, and east into the Caucasus. Wherever they went, they founded monasteries, taught local scribes, and translated Byzantine laws and chronicles. These communities became outposts of Byzantine influence that lasted long after the empire's political power faded. Shared faith created durable alliances. The Serbian kingdom, the Bulgarian Empire, and the Russian principalities all saw themselves as members of an Orthodox commonwealth centered on Constantinople. When they fought each other, they fought as brothers in sin, but when an external enemy like the Turks threatened, they could sometimes unite under the banner of the cross. This religious diplomacy was not always successful. Some conversions were superficial. Some allies betrayed their faith for political gain, but over the long arc of Byzantine history, the Orthodox Church was one of the empire's most reliable assets. It cost far less than an army, it inspired devotion that no payment could buy, and it gave the emperor a moral authority that no barbarian warlord could claim. When the Byzantines spoke of their civilization as the New Rome, they meant it not just as a political claim but as a sacred one. They were the guardians of the true faith, and that faith, more than any wall or treaty, ensured that enemies thought twice before attacking. But even this spiritual armor had a weakness. Religious loyalty could become a source of division when rival Christian kingdoms rose to challenge Constantinople's supremacy. And in time, that division would open a door for enemies who felt no reverence for the cross at all. Gold was a weapon in the Byzantine arsenal, and it was often wielded before a single arrow was fired. Paying an enemy was not a sign of weakness. It was a calculated investment in survival, a way to buy time when the alternative was a costly war that could drain the treasury and leave the empire vulnerable to greater threats. The Byzantines understood this logic better than any power of their age. They treated tribute payments as a business transaction, not a humiliation. The question they asked was brutally pragmatic. Was it cheaper to fight this enemy now or to pay them off and prepare for a stronger defense later? More often than not, the numbers favored payment. Consider the Avars, a nomadic confederation that menaced the Balkan frontier in the 6th and 7th centuries. The Avars were superb horsemen, capable of launching devastating raids that could reach the gates of Constantinople itself. The empire could have sent armies to chase them across the plains, but that would have cost lives and resources with no guarantee of a decisive victory. Instead, the emperors chose to pay the Avars an annual tribute in gold and gifts. Year after year, the gold flowed north, and year after year, the Avars turned their attention elsewhere, raiding other tribes or extracting tribute from weaker neighbors. It was an expensive habit, but it kept the empire's core provinces safe while the Byzantines rebuilt their strength. When the Avars grew too demanding, the Byzantines simply stopped paying and let the Avar threat collapse under its own weight as their enemies attacked them from other sides. The same logic applied to the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century. As the Seljuks swept into Anatolia, the Byzantines faced a terrifying new enemy with vast cavalry armies and a hunger for conquest. Rather than fight a series of expensive campaigns that would bleed the empire dry, the emperors sometimes chose to negotiate truces that involved giving the Seljuks gold or trade privileges. This was not surrender. It was a recognition that the empire could not fight every threat simultaneously. By paying the Seljuks, the Byzantines bought time to reorganize their armies, secure alliances, and address other dangers on their borders. The tactic did not always succeed in the long run, but it bought years of peace when the empire needed it most. The secret to this strategy lay in the Byzantine economy. The empire minted a gold coin called the Bezant, a stable and widely respected currency that circulated from England to India. Foreign rulers trusted the Bezant because it retained its value over decades. When a Byzantine diplomat offered a chest of these coins as tribute, the recipient knew they were receiving genuine wealth, not debased currency or worthless promises. This reliability made the Byzantines dependable partners in the art of bribery. A chieftain who accepted gold from Constantinople was not just receiving money. He was entering a relationship of mutual benefit, one that could be renewed year after year as long as the payments continued. The gold itself became a tool of influence, linking the recipient to the empire in a web of dependence. Of course, not every enemy could be bought. Some were too proud, too fanatical, or too powerful to be satisfied with gold alone. The Persians wanted territory. The Arabs wanted religious submission. The Turks wanted conquest, but for those enemies whose price was reasonable, tribute was a bargain compared to war. The Byzantines calculated the cost of a campaign. The the soldiers who would never return, the crops that would be burned, the trade routes that would be disrupted, and then they compared it to the cost of a few thousand gold coins handed over once a year. The math was often clear: paying was cheaper. This economic approach to survival was not a one-time fix. It was a habitual practice embedded in the empire's financial planning. The Byzantine treasury set aside funds specifically for diplomacy and tribute, just as modern governments budget for defense. It was a line item on a ledger, not a desperate concession. And because the empire was rich in gold, it could afford to make these payments over decades without collapsing. The Avars were paid for generations. The Bulgars were bought off repeatedly. Even the mighty Arab caliphates accepted tribute in times of negotiation, though they rarely honored their promises for long. Yet the strategy had limits. Paying tribute could create dependency on the part of the recipient, but it could also create dependency for the payer. If an emperor grew too accustomed to buying peace, he might neglect the armies and fortifications needed to defend the empire in a crisis. And if the treasury ever ran dry, the payments stopped and the enemies would return with fresh demands. The Byzantines understood this risk. They used tribute as a temporary measure, a way to buy time while preparing for the inevitable struggle. They did not see it as a permanent solution, but as a tool in a broader strategy of survival. In the end, the empire's willingness to pay off enemies was not a sign of cowardice. It was a sign of sophistication. It reflected a deep understanding that power could take many forms, not just swords and siege engines, but gold, patience, and the wisdom to know when to make a deal. The Byzantines lived by a simple rule: better to lose some gold than to lose a province. Better to buy another year of peace than to spend your sons in a war you could not win. And that pragmatism, born of necessity, became one of the pillars that kept Constantinople standing long after its enemies had exhausted themselves in fruitless conflict. The Theodosian Walls were not just a barrier, they were a complete system of layered defense, a masterpiece of military engineering that turned Constantinople into an almost unconquerable fortress. When an enemy army approached, they faced not one wall but three, plus a moat, plus a killing ground, plus a network of towers that allowed defenders to fire from multiple angles. The moat was wide and deep, filled with water that could be diverted from nearby streams. Any attacker who crossed it would find themselves in a narrow space between the moat and the outer wall, exposed to missiles from above. That outer wall was lower, but it was thick enough to absorb catapult fire. If the enemy breached it, they would then face the inner wall, a towering structure that rose 40 feet high and was reinforced with 96 towers. Behind those walls, the defenders were safe. They could rotate troops, bring up fresh supplies, and rain down arrows and boiling oil on anyone who tried to scale the stone. The Byzantines did not rely on a single point of strength. They built redundancy into every part of their fortifications. If one section fell, the next line was already waiting. But the walls of Constantinople were only the most famous example of a much larger system. Across the empire, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia and the rolling plains of the Balkans, a network of fortresses stood guard. These were not massive cities, they were smaller strongholds, each positioned at a strategic crossroads, a mountain pass, a river crossing, or a narrow valley that invaders had to use. Each fortress was built to hold out for weeks or even months against a siege. Inside, there were cisterns for water, granaries for food, and barracks for a small garrison of soldiers. When an enemy army appeared, the local population would gather their livestock and valuables and retreat inside these walls. The invaders could burn the empty villages, but they could not capture the people or seize the supplies. And while they wasted time trying to break through one fortress, the Byzantine field army was mobilizing somewhere else. This was defense in depth, a strategy that traded space for time. The fortresses did not need to stop the invasion. They only needed to slow it down. Every day an enemy spent besieging a minor fort was a day the imperial army could march from the capital. Every supply wagon that had to be guarded against raiders from a fortress was a drain on the invaders' strength. The invaders would find their advance grinding to a halt, their soldiers exhausted, their provisions running low, while fresh Byzantine troops arrived to cut off their retreat. The thermi of the system worked because the Byzantines understood the value of patience. They did not try to meet every invasion at the border. They let the enemy penetrate deep into their territory, where they would be surrounded by hostile fortresses and denied access to food and water. Then, when the invader was tired and hungry, the Byzantine field army would strike, choosing the moment and the ground most favorable to them. It was a strategy that had been perfected over centuries, a quiet, patient approach that turned the empire itself into a trap. The walls of Constantinople and the fortresses of the provinces formed a single, coherent system of survival. They were the physical embodiment of the economy of force principle. Instead of wasting lives in endless border skirmishes, the Byzantines invested in stone and mortar, building defenses that could hold out for years. And when those defenses finally fell, it was not because the walls were weak. It was because the empire had run out of soldiers to stand behind them. But for 1,000 years those stones held, a silent testament to a people who learned that the cheapest victory was the one that never had to be fought at all. The sea was the empire's other wall, and it was guarded by a weapon that no enemy could understand. While the Theodosian Walls kept invaders at bay on land, the Byzantine navy ruled the waters around Constantinople, and at the heart of that naval power lay a secret so closely guarded that its recipe vanished from history. This was Greek fire, a flaming liquid that could be sprayed from ships that burned on water, and that turned the tide of countless battles. The Byzantines did not have the largest fleet in the Mediterranean. They rarely matched the numbers of their Arab or Norman rivals, but they did not need to. Greek fire was a force multiplier, a technological marvel that allowed a small squadron to destroy a much larger enemy armada. Imagine a battle at sea. Two fleets face each other. The Byzantine ships called dromons are sleek and fast, rowed by oarsmen and carrying a crew of marines. But their most fearsome feature is hidden at the bow, a bronze tube often shaped like a lion's head, connected to a pressurized pump and a cauldron of the mysterious mixture. When the enemy ships close in, the Byzantines ignite the substance, and a stream of liquid fire shoots across the water, clinging to wood, sails, and flesh. It cannot be extinguished with water. It only burns more fiercely. The enemy panics. Their ships become floating infernos. The battle is over before it truly begins. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown to this day. Historians believe it was a blend of petroleum, sulfur, and quicklime, but the precise formula was a state secret, passed down from emperor to emperor, known only to a handful of artisans who built the weapons and the ships. The Byzantines understood that secrecy was a weapon in itself. If their enemies never learned how to replicate Greek fire, they could never fully counter it. And for centuries that secrecy held. Arab fleets tried to capture Byzantine ships and copy the technology, but they never succeeded. The secret died with the empire. Controlling the sea meant controlling the lifelines of the empire. Constantinople was a massive city, home to hundreds of thousands of people, and it could not feed itself. Grain came from Egypt and the Black Sea. Olive oil, wine, and timber came from Anatolia and Greece. All of this traveled by ship. If the sea routes were cut, the city would starve within months. The Byzantine navy ensured that these supply lines remained open, even during the most desperate sieges. When the Arab fleets blockaded Constantinople in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Byzantine navy broke through with Greek fire, delivering food and reinforcements to the defenders. The city survived not because its walls were unbreachable, but because its ships kept the pantry full. the navy also projected power far beyond the capital. Byzantine warships patrolled the Aegean, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea. They suppressed piracy, escorted merchant convoys, and carried ambassadors and missionaries to distant lands. When the empire needed to enforce a treaty or intimidate a rebellious province, the appearance of a Drummond squadron was often enough. The ships were mobile fortresses, capable of landing troops, blockading ports, and raiding enemy coasts. This maritime reach allowed the Byzantines to maintain ties with their remote provinces, from Sicily in the west to Crimea in the north. Without the navy, those provinces would have been isolated and lost. Naval dominance also protected the empire's greatest vulnerability, the city itself. Constantinople sat at a strategic crossroads where Europe met Asia and the Black Sea met the Mediterranean. Any enemy who controlled the sea could cut the city off from the world. The Byzantines knew this, so they built a navy that was always ready. They maintained dockyards in the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that sheltered the city's northern side. They trained crews who knew the currents and the winds. They stockpiled timber, pitch, and iron for repairs, and they kept the secret of Greek fire locked away, a final ace that could be played when all else failed. For centuries, this naval supremacy ensured that Constantinople could breathe, even when the land walls were breached in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade. It was not because the navy failed. It was because the empire had grown weak and divided. But for most of its thousand-year history, the Byzantine navy was the silent guardian of the city, the unseen hand that kept the empire alive. And like all great instruments of survival, it was not just about fighting. It was about control, about ensuring that the lungs of the empire never stopped drawing breath. Yet even this mastery of the sea could not shield the empire from the slow erosion of time. The strategic economy of force that had kept Byzantium alive for so long would eventually face its greatest test, a challenge that no amount of fire or diplomacy could overcome. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans. To them, the Roman Empire had not fallen in the 5th century. It had simply moved east, shifting its center from the Tiber to the Bosphorus. This was not a convenient fiction. It was a deep, unshakable belief that shaped every aspect of their identity, their politics, and their will to survive. When the western provinces were overrun by barbarian kingdoms, the people of Constantinople did not see a collapse. They saw a temporary setback, a tragedy that had befallen one part of the Roman world while the other part remained strong and true. The emperor in Constantinople was the rightful heir to Augustus and Constantine. The Senate still met, the laws still applied, the legions still marched, even if they now called themselves thematic armies. The idea of Rome had not died. It had simply changed its address. This ideology of imperial continuity was the empire's invisible armor. It sustained morale when everything else seemed lost. When invaders breached the frontiers and provinces fell, the Byzantines could tell themselves that this was not the end. Rome had survived worse. The empire had been reborn before. Their history was filled with stories of recovery, of emperors who rebuilt after disaster, of walls that were repaired and armies that were reformed. This sense of destiny gave them the patience to endure long sieges and the courage to negotiate humiliating tributes, knowing that survival was victory in itself. The ideology also justified decisions that might otherwise have seemed cowardly or weak. Paying tribute to barbarians was not shameful if it bought time for the true Rome to gather strength. Retreating from a lost province was not abandonment if the province could be reclaimed later. Every pragmatic choice was framed as a strategic pause, a temporary concession to fate, not a surrender of Roman identity. This mindset attracted loyalty from an extraordinarily diverse population. The Byzantine Empire was a patchwork of peoples: Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, Slavs, and many others. They spoke different languages and followed different customs, but they all shared a common identity as Romans, citizens of the Eternal Empire. The emperor was not just a Greek ruler. He was the Roman emperor, the highest authority on earth, chosen by God to defend the Christian world. This gave his rule a legitimacy that transcended ethnicity. An Armenian general could serve loyally because he believed he was fighting for Rome, not for a foreign king. A Syrian merchant could pay taxes willingly because he saw himself as part of a universal civilization, not a conquered province. Emperors understood the power of this idea and used it deliberately. From the 7th century Heraclius, who rallied the empire after its near destruction by Persia, to the last emperor Constantine XI in the 15th century, each leader invoked the same legacy. They spoke of their predecessors, of Constantine the Great, of Justinian, of the long chain of rulers who had guarded the Roman flame. They reminded their subjects that they were part of a story that stretched back more than 1,000 years, a story that was not finished. When the walls were breached in 1453, Constantine XI did not surrender. He reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the ranks of the attackers, choosing to die as a Roman emperor rather than flee as a broken king. That final act of defiance was the ultimate expression of the ideology. The empire could fall, but the idea of Rome would never truly die. It would live on in the hearts of those who remembered. In this way, the Byzantines built their survival on more than walls, diplomacy, or gold. They built it on a shared story, a belief that they were the bearers of a sacred inheritance. That belief gave them the strength to endure what no other empire could: 1,000 years of constant pressure, endless enemies, and slow, grinding decline. It was the last and most resilient layer of their strategic economy of force, a resource that could never be looted or burned, only passed from generation to generation. And it is this same stubborn faith that explains why, even after the city fell, the memory of Byzantium refused to vanish. The 7th century brought the empire to its breaking point. Imagine a single decade where enemies emerged from every direction at once. From the east, the Sassanid Persians swept through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, seizing the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine world. From the northwest, the Avars and their Slavic allies poured across the Danube, burning cities and driving the population into fortified refuges. In 610, when the Emperor Heraclius took the throne, the situation was desperate. The Persians had already captured Jerusalem and carried off what was believed to be the true cross, a relic of immense religious significance. The Avars were at the gates of Constantinople itself. The empire seemed to be in its final hours, yet Heraclius did not panic. He did not rush into a rash counterattack. Instead, he did what the Byzantine strategic tradition demanded. He stepped back, assessed all available tools, and began to rebuild from the ground up. His first move was diplomatic. He could not fight both the Persians and the Avars at the same time. So he negotiated with the Avars, offering them tribute and a promise of friendship. The Avars accepted. They were a mercenary people, and gold spoke louder than any vow of eternal war. With the western frontier temporarily pacified, Heraclius could turn his full attention to the Persians. But even then, he did not simply raise an army. He understood that the empire's greatest weapon was not its soldiers but its faith. He turned to the Orthodox Church and began a campaign of religious unification. He called for a series of synods and councils to heal the doctrinal divisions that had weakened the empire for centuries. He presented himself not just as a military leader, but as a defender of the true faith. In Constantinople, he led the people in processions and prayers, displaying icons and relics to rally their spirits. The clergy preached that this was a holy war, a struggle for the survival of Christendom itself. With the population united behind him, Heraclius then began to rebuild the army. He did not have the resources to field a massive force. so he used the strategic economy of force in its purest form. He gathered a relatively small but highly motivated army, one that was willing to march far from home and fight on its own terms. He spent years training them, stockpiling supplies, and forging alliances with the Christian kingdoms of the Caucasus, who had their own grievances against Persia. Then, in 622, he launched his counterattack. He did not try to reclaim lost provinces one by one. Instead, he struck deep into Persian territory, bypassing heavily fortified cities and targeting the Persian heartland itself. His army lived off the land, moving fast and surprising the enemy at every turn. He used the rugged terrain of the Armenian highlands to neutralize the Persian advantage in cavalry. He fought not a single decisive battle but a series of campaigns that gradually wore down the Persian war machine. Inside Persia, Heraclius exploited every weakness. He captured the Persian royal palace at Dastagerd, seizing vast treasures and forcing the Persian king to flee. But his greatest victory was not military. It was symbolic. When the Persians offered peace, Heraclius demanded the return of the true cross. In 630, he personally carried the relic back to Jerusalem, walking barefoot through the streets in a ceremony of triumph and humility. The empire was saved. The provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were restored. The Avars, seeing the sudden shift in fortune, quickly agreed to a permanent peace. In less than 2 decades, Heraclius had taken an empire on the verge of collapse and restored it to its former strength, all by combining diplomacy, religious unity, and a precise, economical use of force. This was the strategy of the strategic economy of force in its fullest expression. Heraclius did not win by overwhelming numbers or by permanent conquest. He won by understanding the limits of his resources, by timing his moves carefully, and by using every tool available, including faith, gold, and the sheer will of his people. The 7th century crisis proved that the Byzantine model worked, even under the most extreme pressure, but it also revealed a dangerous truth. The empire had survived only by exhausting every reserve. And after Heraclius, new enemies were already gathering, enemies who would test the same strategy again and again for the next 800 years. The Arab fleets arrived in 674 with a single purpose. For the first time, the Caliph's armies had the strength, the ships, and the determination to strike at the heart of the empire. They had already conquered Syria, Egypt, and much of North Africa. Constantinople now lay open, a tempting prize that would complete the Muslim domination of the Mediterranean world. The siege that followed was not a sudden assault. It was a slow, grinding blockade that lasted 4 years, a test of endurance for both sides. Each spring, the Arab fleet sailed through the Marmara Sea and anchored near the city walls, cutting off supplies and launching repeated attacks. Yet each time the defenders held, the Theodosian Walls proved as impenetrable as ever, and the Byzantine navy unleashed Greek fire against the Arab ships. The liquid flame spread across the water, setting hulls ablaze and breaking the blockade time and again. The Arabs had no answer. They could not breach the walls, and they could not control the sea. After 4 seasons of futility, they withdrew in 678, their fleet shattered and their morale broken. It was a setback, but not the end. The Caliphate learned from its failure, and 40 years later, it returned with even greater force. In 717, a massive combined land and sea army appeared before Constantinople. This time, the Arabs brought a fleet of over 1,800 ships, far larger than before, and a land army that marched across Anatolia. They also brought a plan. They would besiege the city from both sides, starving it into submission. The Byzantine emperor at the time, Leo III, understood the stakes. He did not meet the invaders in open battle. Instead, he prepared the city for a long siege. He stockpiled food, repaired the walls, and organized the defense with meticulous care. He also sent urgent appeals to the Bulgars, the nomadic people who controlled the lands north of Constantinople. Leo knew that the key to survival was not just the city's own defenses, but the ability to pressure the Arabs from another direction. The Bulgar Khan, a shrewd leader named Tervel, responded to the call. He had his own reasons to fear the expanding caliphate, and the Byzantines offered generous terms. In the winter of 717, as the Arab army camped before the walls, the Bulgars struck from the rear. They raided the enemy supply lines, burned their stores, and harassed their camps. The Arabs, already struggling with the cold and a shortage of provisions, began to weaken. Meanwhile, the Byzantine navy again used Greek fire to devastate the Arab fleet. Ship after ship went up in flames. The sea turned into a graveyard of charred timber. By the summer of 718, the Arab commander had no choice. The army was starving, the fleet was destroyed, and the Bulgars were closing in. He ordered a retreat. The siege of 717 was the last serious attempt by the Umayyad Caliphate to capture Constantinople. It failed not because of a single miracle or a lucky break, but because the Byzantine system worked exactly as intended. The walls held, the navy struck when it mattered, and diplomacy with the Bulgars turned a potential enemy into an ally at the crucial moment. The strategic economy of force had once again absorbed a massive shock and adapted. The failure of these sieges shifted the balance of power permanently. The Arab drive westward stalled. Constantinople remained a Christian fortress in the east, a symbol that the empire was not destined to fall. For centuries afterward, the Byzantine capital stood as a bulwark, a testament to the idea that survival is not an accident. It is the product of a coherent strategy, a willingness to use every tool, and the patience to wait while your enemy exhausts himself against your walls. The empire had weathered its greatest storm yet, and in doing so, it gained a generation of peace in which to rebuild. That peace, however, would not last forever. New enemies were already rising in the east, and the same system that had repelled the Arabs would be tested again and again. But for now, the city of the world's desire had proved that it could survive almost anything. The Macedonian dynasty turned centuries of survival into a golden age of recovery. Between the rule of Basil I in 867 and the death of Basil II in 1056, the Byzantine Empire experienced a remarkable period of expansion and internal stability. But this was not simple empire building. It was the strategic economy of force applied to a new situation. After enduring waves of invasion and near collapse, the empire finally had breathing room, a full treasury, and a military that had been refined by generations of defensive warfare. Now the Byzantines could go on the offensive, but they did so without abandoning the principles that had kept them alive. They still avoided large, reckless campaigns. They still relied on diplomacy and alliances to weaken their enemies before the first arrow flew, and they still managed their finances with the caution of a household that had once nearly gone bankrupt. The result was a series of focused, well-planned military actions that reclaimed lost territory without overextending the empire or draining its resources. The most visible successes came in the east. For centuries, the Arab caliphates had held parts of Syria, Cilicia, and the upper Euphrates, provinces that had once been the heartland of the Roman East. The Macedonian emperors did not try to conquer the entire caliphate. That would have been impossible. Instead, they targeted specific regions that were strategically valuable, such as the fortresses along the Taurus Mountains that guarded the approaches to Anatolia. Campaign after campaign, Byzantine generals like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes pushed the frontier forward. They captured cities like Tarsus and Antioch, not by overwhelming force, but by careful siege warfare, by cutting supply lines, and by exploiting divisions among the local Arab rulers. They also used the old tactic of alliance building, making deals with Armenian princes and local Christian communities who resented caliphate rule. These reconquests were not a blitzkrieg. They were a slow, patient expansion, each step supported by a network of fortifications, a reliable tax base, and a professional army that knew how to fight a limited war. On the Balkan frontier, the same approach played out against the Bulgarians. The First Bulgarian Empire had been a persistent threat for centuries, raiding deep into Thrace and even threatening Constantinople itself. But under the Macedonian dynasty, the Byzantines turned the tables. They did not try to conquer Bulgaria in a single campaign. Instead, they used a combination of military pressure, diplomatic isolation, and internal subversion. They allied with the Rus, the Pechenegs, and other steppe peoples to attack Bulgaria from the north. They supported Bulgarian rebels who opposed their own king. And when the time was right, they launched a decisive invasion led by Emperor Basil II himself. The war was brutal but measured. Basil did not annihilate the Bulgarian army in one battle. He methodically captured key fortresses, cut off supplies, and forced the Bulgarian Tsar to surrender after years of grinding pressure. When the war ended in 1018, Basil famously blinded most of the captured Bulgarian soldiers, a harsh act that historians still debate, but his goal was not to destroy the Bulgarian people. It was to eliminate them as a military threat for a generation. The former Bulgarian lands were integrated into the empire as a new province, not as a conquered territory to be exploited, but as a region that would be administered and taxed just like any other. The conquest was complete, but it was also economical. Basil had used the minimum force necessary to achieve a permanent solution. Behind these military successes lay a fiscal system that was the envy of the medieval world. The Macedonian emperors reformed the tax collection system, reduced corruption, and built up a treasury that could fund campaigns without borrowing from future generations. They also invested in infrastructure, repairing roads, building bridges, and fortifying border posts, all of which made military operations easier and cheaper. They understood that a soldier in the field cost gold, but a well-maintained fortress could defend itself with a small garrison for decades. The economy of force principle now extended to every part of the state. Money saved in one area could be spent on another, and the goal was always the same: achieve maximum security with minimum waste. Culturally, the Macedonian Renaissance was a flowering of art, literature, and scholarship. Emperors and patriarchs patronized the copying of ancient manuscripts, the writing of histories, and the creation of stunning mosaics and icons. This cultural revival was not separate from the strategic economy of force. It was part of it. A confident, educated, and united population was easier to govern and more willing to support the state in times of war. The court remained the center of Roman identity, a place where the old traditions of law and administration were preserved and adapted. The Byzantine Empire in the 10th century was a state that had learned to live within its means, to fight only necessary wars, and to build alliances that lasted. It was not invincible, but it was powerful enough to project strength across 3 continents. Yet even this golden age contained the seeds of future trouble. The successful expansion created new responsibilities, longer borders to defend, more provinces to administer, and a larger army to maintain. The system that had worked so well for a compact, defensive empire now had to adapt to the demands of a growing state. The strategic economy of force would face new tests, and the answers that had worked for centuries might not be enough when the next wave of enemies arrived. But for a few generations, the Macedonian emperors had shown that careful planning, fiscal discipline, and focused military action could turn a survivor into a conqueror without losing the wisdom that had kept the empire alive through its darkest days. But success carried a hidden price. the Macedonian dynasty left behind an empire that was larger, richer, and more confident than ever, but also one that had outgrown the very system that made it strong. The theme system, that ingenious network of soldier farmers who defended their own land, began to erode almost as soon as the empire stopped shrinking. For centuries, the themes had worked because land was plentiful and the threat was constant. A farmer knew that his plot came with a duty to fight, and he accepted it because his home was on the frontier. But as the Byzantine army went on the offensive and pushed the borders outward, the old frontier provinces became safer. The need for local defense faded. And with that safety came a new temptation. Powerful families and wealthy landowners began to buy up the small plots of the soldier farmers, absorbing them into vast estates. The emperors tried to stop this. They passed laws forbidding the sale of military lands, but the bureaucracy could not enforce them, and the aristocrats grew bolder. By the middle of the 11th century, the theme armies had shrunk dramatically. The soldiers who had once defended their own villages for free were now replaced by hired professionals who demanded payment in gold. At the same time, the empire's fiscal discipline began to slip. The Macedonian emperors had built a treasury that could fund careful campaigns and generous diplomacy. But their successors, caught in a cycle of court intrigue and rapid turnover of rulers, spent recklessly. To buy the loyalty of powerful generals or to pay for expensive ceremonies, they debased the currency. They reduced the gold content of the bezant, the trusted coin that had been the backbone of Byzantine economic power. Merchants and foreign rulers noticed. The bezant began to lose its value, and with a weaker currency, the empire could no longer afford the same level of tribute or the same quality of mercenaries. The cost of everything rose while the treasury's purchasing power fell. The result was a growing dependence on foreign soldiers. Mercenaries from the west, from the steppes, and from Scandinavia filled the ranks of the Byzantine army. They were skilled, but they were expensive, and they owed no loyalty to the land they defended. When the gold ran low, they mutinied or simply left. The empire's military flexibility, the ability to choose when and where to fight, collapsed. Now every campaign required a huge upfront payment, and if the money was not there, the army dissolved. Political instability made everything worse. Between 1025 and 1081, a string of short-lived emperors came and went, many of them rising through assassination or palace coups. Each new ruler tried to undo the policies of his predecessor. Tax systems were changed, land grants were revoked, and military commands were shuffled. The bureaucracy that had once run like a well-oiled machine became a playground for rival factions. Provincial governors ignored orders from the capital. Generals fought each other instead of the enemy. The empire that had once outlasted its rivals by making decisions slowly and carefully now lurched from crisis to crisis. It was in this weakened state that the Byzantines faced a new enemy from the east, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a nomadic people who had converted to Islam and built a powerful empire in Persia. They were fast, mobile, and skilled archers, and they saw the crumbling Byzantine frontier in Anatolia as an open door. For years, Turkish raiders swept across the plateau, looting, burning, and withdrawing before a proper army could respond. The Byzantine commanders, short on funds and distracted by court politics, could not mount an effective defense. They tried diplomacy, offering the Seljuk Sultan generous terms for peace. But the Sultan was not interested in gold or titles. He wanted land. In 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes gathered a large army funded by borrowing and by melting down church treasure. He marched east to confront the Seljuks directly near a fortress called Manzikert. The battle that followed was not a catastrophic slaughter. It was more like a slow unraveling. The Byzantine army was large but poorly organized, a mix of native troops, foreign mercenaries, and reluctant allies. The Seljuks under Sultan Alp Arslan used their classic tactics, feigned retreats, arrows from a distance, and attacks on the flanks. The Byzantine lines held for a while, but then a key unit of mercenaries, the Cumans, switched sides. Other allied contingents, seeing the betrayal, fled the field. In the confusion, the emperor himself was captured. Historians note that the losses at Manzikert were not enormous in terms of soldiers, but the political and psychological damage was immense. The emperor was in enemy hands, the army was scattered, and the Turks, who had been raiders, now saw that the heart of Anatolia lay open before them. Within a decade, they had swept across the plateau, establishing their own capital at Nicaea, just 100 miles from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire lost its richest recruiting ground, its source of grain, and its strategic depth. The theme system in Anatolia was gone, and with it, the foundation of the old defensive strategy. Manzikert was not the death blow. The empire would survive for nearly 4 more centuries, but it was the moment when the cracks in the system became impossible to ignore. The strategic economy of force required patience, discipline, and a strong treasury. The 11th century Byzantines had lost all three. They had overextended, underfunded, and divided themselves. And now the Seljuks were inside the fortress, and the walls of Constantinople would have to hold once again, but this time with a much smaller hinterland to draw upon. The old formula of gold, diplomacy, and patient defense was still remembered, but the ingredients were running low. By the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Anatolia, the empire's heartland, was lost to the Seljuk Turks. The treasury was empty. The army was a collection of mutinous mercenaries, and yet, within a single generation, a new dynasty would pull the empire back from the edge. The Komnenian restoration, beginning with Alexios I in 1081, was not a miracle. It was a conscious return to the very strategy that had kept Byzantium alive for centuries, but adapted to a world that had changed beyond recognition. Alexios inherited a throne that was almost worthless. The Normans were invading from the west, the Pechenegs were raiding from the north, and the Seljuks held Nicaea, a city visible from Constantinople's walls on a clear day. The empire had lost its recruiting grounds, its tax base, and its strategic depth. Everything the old system had relied on was gone. Alexios understood that he could not rebuild the theme armies of the past. There was no land left in Anatolia to grant to soldier farmers. Instead, he looked for new tools that would achieve the same goal: a reliable, affordable military that could defend the empire without bankrupting it. His first move was diplomatic, and it was audacious. He turned to the one power that had both the military strength and the religious motivation to help: the kingdoms of Western Europe. In 1095, Alexios sent a desperate plea to Pope Urban II, asking for mercenaries to fight the Turks. What he got instead was the First Crusade, a massive wave of armed pilgrims who poured across the Balkans and into Anatolia. Alexios was not naive. He knew these crusaders were not loyal subjects. They were ambitious lords with their own agendas, but he saw them as a tool, a disposable force that could reclaim lost Byzantine territory without costing the empire a single soldier. He negotiated carefully, demanding that the Crusader leaders swear fealty to him and promise to return any former Byzantine cities they captured. The plan worked, at least for a while. The Crusaders stormed Nicaea in 1097 and returned it to Byzantine control. They pushed deep into Syria, carving out their own kingdoms, but they also weakened the Seljuks and gave the empire breathing room. Alexios had used foreign armies as a blunt instrument, the same way his ancestors had used mercenaries, but on a much larger scale. It was the economy of force principle applied to international politics. Let the Western knights bleed themselves against the Turks while the empire rebuilt at home. At the same time, Alexios reformed the Byzantine army from within. He could not afford a large standing force, so he created a smaller, more disciplined corps. He revived the Tagmata, the elite regiments stationed near Constantinople, and filled their ranks with loyal soldiers rather than unreliable foreigners. He also reorganized the provincial forces, establishing a new system that would replace the old themes. This was the pronoia system, a clever adaptation of the old land-for-service model. Instead of granting land to small soldier farmers, the emperor granted revenues from specific estates to powerful individuals, usually military commanders. In return, those individuals had to provide a set number of armed soldiers for the imperial army, equipped and paid from the income they received. The pronoia holders became a new military aristocracy, bound to the emperor by personal loyalty and economic dependence. They were not independent lords like the Western knights. Their grants were not hereditary, at least not at first. They could be revoked or reassigned. This gave the emperor control while creating a network of local defense forces that cost the treasury almost nothing. The pronoia system was the old theme system adapted to a world where land was scarce and power had shifted to a wealthy elite. It was not perfect. It concentrated military power in the hands of a few families who would later become a threat to the throne, but in the short term it worked. The army became more loyal, more reliable, and cheaper to maintain. Alexios also reasserted central control over the provinces. He curbed the power of the old bureaucratic families who had enriched themselves during the chaos of the 11th century. He appointed trusted relatives and loyal generals as governors, ensuring that the empire's resources flowed back to the capital. He reformed the tax system, eliminating corruption and rebuilding the treasury. Within a generation, Constantinople was once again a wealthy city, capable of funding diplomacy, paying mercenaries, and maintaining its walls. The Komnenian emperors who followed Alexios, especially John II and Manuel I, continued this work. They launched campaigns to recapture lost territory in Anatolia, using the army they had rebuilt and the diplomatic network they had restored. They did not try to reconquer the entire Seljuk Sultanate. That would have been impossible. Instead, they focused on strategic targets, forts, passes, and fertile valleys that could be held and defended. They applied the old logic of limited war, choosing their battles carefully, avoiding overreach, and always keeping the treasury in mind. By the middle of the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was once again a major power. Its army could march into Syria, its navy controlled the Aegean, and its diplomats played the kings of Europe against each other. The Komnenian restoration was a remarkable achievement, a testament to the resilience of the strategic tradition that had kept the empire alive for so long. But it was also a fragile revival. It depended on the competence of individual emperors, on the loyalty of the pronoia holders, and on the continued willingness of the West to cooperate. Those threads would not hold forever. The dynasty itself would eventually fray, and new enemies, both from within and from outside, would test the empire once more. For now, though, the old strategy had worked again. Byzantium had learned to survive by adapting its core principles to new circumstances, proving that the economy of force was not a fixed formula but a living tradition, one that could be reimagined when the world changed around it. The fragile revival of the Komnenian dynasty lasted less than a century before a catastrophe no strategy could have predicted. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, originally intended to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control, turned its fury against Constantinople itself. The Crusaders, driven by ambition, debt, and a bitter feud within the Byzantine imperial family, broke through the Theodosian Walls and stormed the city. For 3 days they looted and burned, carrying away centuries of accumulated wealth in gold, jewels, and sacred relics. The great library was destroyed. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were taken to Venice. The empire's heart had been ripped out not by a foreign enemy, but by fellow Christians who had been invited to help. This event shattered the very foundation of the Byzantine strategy. The economy of force had always relied on a single, centralized capital that could project power, store treasure, and coordinate diplomacy. After the sack, Constantinople became the capital of a new Latin empire, a Western feudal kingdom planted on the Bosphorus. The Byzantine government fled into exile. Three major successor states emerged: the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Each claimed to be the true Roman heir. Each fought the others as often as they fought the Latins. The unity that had been the empire's greatest internal weapon dissolved overnight. The old strategy could not function under these conditions. Diplomacy required a single voice speaking for Rome. Now there were three voices, each contradicting the other. The treasury, which had been built over generations, was gone. The walls of Constantinople, the symbol of invincibility, were now held by the enemy. The network of allies and client states that had surrounded the empire for centuries collapsed because there was no one center to negotiate with. Even the Orthodox Church, the spiritual glue of the Byzantine world, was divided. The Latin Patriarch imposed by the Crusaders tried to force submission to Rome, creating deep bitterness that would never fully heal. The successor states did their best to continue the traditions of the old empire. The rulers of Nicaea, in particular, rebuilt a court, minted coins, and maintained a small army. They used what remained of the diplomatic toolkit, marrying into foreign dynasties, paying tribute to powerful neighbors, and cultivating alliances with the Seljuks and the Mongols. But they operated from a position of weakness. They could not project power far beyond their own borders. They could not command the same respect from foreign kings who now saw Byzantium as a fallen house, not the eternal Roman Empire. The strategic economy of force had always depended on the perception of strength, on the idea that Constantinople was the center of the world. After 1204, that perception was shattered forever. The worst part was the betrayal. The Fourth Crusade had been diverted to Constantinople by a combination of Venetian greed and Byzantine internal politics. A young prince, Alexios IV, had promised the Crusaders vast sums if they helped him seize the throne. When he failed to pay, the Crusaders turned on the city. This betrayal poisoned relations between Byzantium and the West for generations. The memory of Latin knights desecrating churches, stealing relics, and slaughtering the citizens of the empire's capital became a wound that never closed. In the centuries that followed, Byzantine emperors would appeal to the West for help against the Turks, but they could never fully trust the very people who had once destroyed them. The economy of force had always relied on the ability to make allies and keep promises. Now trust was broken and the empire paid the price. The Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted only 57 years. In 1261, the forces of the Empire of Nicaea, led by Michael VIII Palaiologos, recaptured the city without a fight. The Byzantine Empire was restored. But it was a hollow revival. The sack of 1204 had destroyed too much. The population of Constantinople had fallen dramatically. The trade networks that had once brought wealth from every corner of the known world now bypassed the city, flowing instead through Venetian and Genoese ports. The treasury was empty. The army was a shadow of its former self. The empire that returned to Constantinople was a small, impoverished state, barely able to defend its own walls, let alone project power across the Mediterranean. The Fourth Crusade was the moment when the strategic economy of force broke down completely. It had been designed to cope with external enemies, with Persians and Arabs and Bulgars who could be bribed, diverted, or worn down over time. It had never been designed to handle a collapse from within, a betrayal by supposed allies, and the fragmentation of the empire into squabbling fragments. After 1204, the Byzantine Empire was no longer a great power. It became a survivor clinging to a city that had once been the center of the world but was now a fortress under constant siege. The old tools, diplomacy, gold, patience, still existed, but they were blunt and weak. The empire would endure for another 2 centuries, but it would never regain the strength that the Fourth Crusade had stolen from it. The question now was not how to thrive, but how to delay the inevitable. The empire that returned to Constantinople in 1261 was a ghost of its former self. The city itself, once home to 500,000 people, now held perhaps 50,000. Whole neighborhoods lay abandoned, their churches crumbling, their cisterns dry. The great land walls, still standing, now guarded a capital that could barely muster a garrison to man them. The treasury was so depleted that Emperor Michael VIII had to strip lead from church roofs to mint coins. Across the Bosphorus, the rising power of the Ottoman Turks watched with patient eyes. The Palaeologan dynasty, which would rule until the final fall, inherited a state that had lost almost everything: the tax base, the army, the navy, the network of allies, and the reputation that had once made foreign kings eager to receive a Byzantine princess or a chest of gold. What remained was a single city, a few scattered islands, a strip of land in the Peloponnese, and a strategy that had become a desperate gamble. The strategic economy of force had always depended on having options. The Byzantines could choose to bribe, to negotiate, to fight a limited war, or to wait for an enemy to exhaust himself. But by the 14th century, those options had evaporated. The empire could no longer afford to bribe anyone because the treasury was empty. It could not negotiate from strength because everyone knew the emperor had no army to back up his words. And it could not wait because the Ottomans were not a distant threat to be worn down over generations. They were a growing, expansionist power camped just a few miles from the city walls. The old toolkit was still there, but the tools were rusted and blunt. Emperors tried everything they could think of. They sent desperate embassies to the Pope in Rome, offering to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for military aid. But the price of union was humiliation. The Byzantine clergy had to accept the Pope's authority, a bitter pill that caused riots in the streets of Constantinople. The common people saw it as a betrayal of their faith, and the Western aid never arrived in sufficient strength. They negotiated marriage alliances with the Serbian kingdom, with the Bulgarian Tsars, and even with the Mongol Khans. These marriages brought temporary peace but no lasting security. The emperors also tried the old tactic of paying tribute, but now it was not a strategic investment. It was a survival payment, a desperate subsidy to the Ottomans to buy another year of peace. The gold they sent was not extra wealth from a prosperous treasury. It was scraped together from melting down church plate, from taxing the few remaining merchants, from selling off imperial relics, and every year the Ottomans demanded more. The strategy that had once been a source of strength now became a downward spiral. The more the Byzantines paid, the weaker they grew, and the weaker they grew, the more the Ottomans demanded. There was no longer any room to maneuver, no client kingdom to stir up against the enemy, no rival tribe to bribe into attacking from the rear. The Ottomans were too powerful, and the Byzantine sphere of influence had shrunk to the space inside the city walls. The emperors became vassals in all but name. They had to send troops to fight in Ottoman campaigns, to supply the Ottoman army with provisions, and to watch helplessly as the Turks expanded across the Balkans, surrounding Constantinople on all sides. By the early 15th century, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos traveled across Europe, visiting the courts of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, begging for a crusade that never came. He was a brilliant diplomat, but his diplomacy was hollow. He had nothing to offer but promises and relics. The Western kings listened politely and sent him home with gifts but no armies. The old Byzantine charm, the network of relationships and obligations built over centuries, had been severed by the Fourth Crusade and never fully repaired. The West saw Byzantium as a dying relic, not an ally worth saving. The final decades were a slow, quiet tragedy. The city's population dwindled further. The great palaces fell into disrepair. The harbor, once filled with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean, now saw only the occasional Venetian galley or Turkish merchant vessel. The old system of strategic patience, the ability to absorb shock after shock and still endure, had reached its limit. The empire had lost the resources to do anything but wait, and waiting meant decline. The economy of force had always been a gamble that time was on the empire's side. But time eventually ran out. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought an army of perhaps 80,000 men and a fleet of over 100 ships to the walls of Constantinople. The defenders numbered barely 7,000. The Theodosian Walls still stood, but the men who manned them were exhausted and outnumbered. The sea wall, once guarded by the Byzantine navy, was now defended by a few Genoese ships and a chain stretched across the Golden Horn. The Ottoman ships outflanked that chain by dragging their vessels overland on greased logs, a maneuver that bypassed the defenses entirely. The city could no longer be supplied. The old strategy, which had worked for 1,000 years, had finally failed, not because the walls were weak, but because there was nothing left behind them. The final fall was not a surprise. It was the end of a long, slow process, a death by 1,000 cuts that had begun centuries earlier. The Byzantine Empire had survived so long because it learned to use every tool in its arsenal, to fight only when necessary, to buy peace when it was cheaper, and to patiently outlast its enemies. But the last 2 centuries showed that even the most brilliant strategy cannot succeed without the resources to sustain it. The empire, once the master of the strategic economy of force, became its final victim, a prisoner of its own survival, until there was nothing left to sacrifice. So when the walls finally fell, it was not because the strategy had failed, but because the empire had run out of options to keep it alive. For 1,000 years, the Byzantines had done something that no other power of their age could match. They had learned to treat survival as a science, a constant calculation of cost and return, where every tool was measured against the question of whether it brought them closer to the next sunrise. The strategy they perfected was never written down as a single manual, never carved into stone or taught in a school. It lived in the minds of emperors, generals, and diplomats, passed from one generation to the next through example and instinct. It was a culture of decision-making that valued patience over pride, flexibility over dogma, and long-term stability over short-term glory. At its core, this strategy was a ruthless prioritization. When a new threat appeared, the Byzantines did not ask how to crush the enemy. They asked what outcome would keep the empire intact at the lowest possible cost. If a bribe could buy peace, they paid it without shame. If a marriage alliance could secure a border, they arranged it without hesitation. If a show of force could deter an attack, they deployed exactly enough soldiers to make the point and no more. They understood that every resource spent on one front was a resource not available for another, so they hoarded their strength, choosing their battles with the care of a merchant counting coins. The diplomatic arm was never separate from the military arm. The treasury never acted independently of the church. All these pieces were part of a single machine, and the machine had one purpose: to keep Constantinople standing. The Byzantines were not the strongest empire of their time. They were not the richest or the most populous, but they were the most adaptable. They could bend without breaking, absorb a blow and then shift their weight, wait for the enemy to tire, and then strike at the moment of weakness. This flexibility allowed them to survive catastrophes that would have destroyed any other state. The rise of Islam, the siege of the Avars, the betrayal of the Fourth Crusade. Each time the empire was knocked down, but it always got back up because the strategy was not about winning every battle. It was about enduring until the next opportunity arose. Other empires, more aggressive and more ambitious, rose and fell around them. The Persians, the Arabs, the Bulgars, the Normans, the Seljuks, all of them burned brightly for a few centuries and then faded into history. But Byzantium remained, not because it was invincible, but because it knew that the only victory that truly mattered was the one that allowed you to fight another day. The strategy was a quiet, persistent refusal to accept defeat, a habit of mind that turned every crisis into a problem to be solved rather than a disaster to be mourned. It was the reason why, when the Ottomans finally broke through the walls in 1453, the empire had already outlasted every contemporary by centuries. The strategy did not guarantee eternal life, but it gave Byzantium something almost as valuable: the ability to choose its own ending, to fall only after every other option had been exhausted. In the end, the Byzantine strategy was not a secret formula hidden in a vault. It was a way of seeing the world, a conviction that survival was a choice, not a fate. And that lesson, the triumph of patience and adaptability over brute force, is what makes the story of Byzantium not just a historical curiosity, but a mirror that still reflects the challenges of any civilization that hopes to endure. The Western Roman Empire fell in less than a century. The Byzantine Empire survived for 1,000 years. The difference was not geography, it was not wealth. It was not even the strength of the walls. The difference was a way of thinking, a culture of strategy that one half of Rome had and the other did not. The West never learned to bend. It saw every barbarian invasion as a test of arms to be met with brute force, an endless cycle of victories that could not translate into lasting security. When the Goths crossed the Danube in the late 4th century, the Western emperors tried to fight them. They won battles, they killed thousands, but they could not stop the flow. The Goths kept coming. The Huns pushed other tribes ahead of them. Every year, a new wave of desperate people appeared at the border, and every year, the Western army marched out to meet them with swords drawn. There was no room for negotiation, no consideration of tribute as a tool, no network of spies to anticipate the next threat. The West fought because that was the only answer it knew. The Byzantine East, by contrast, had learned that war was the last resort, not the first. When the Huns under Attila threatened both halves of the empire in the mid-5th century, the East paid him off. It was expensive, but it bought a generation of peace while Attila turned his attention west. The West, however, refused to pay. They sent an army instead. And at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, they fought a bloody, indecisive conflict that left thousands dead and Attila barely weakened. The Huns still sacked Italian cities. The West still bled, and the East watched from a distance, having preserved its own provinces with gold rather than steel. The Western Roman Empire never developed the bureaucratic and diplomatic infrastructure that made Byzantium so resilient. There was no Bureau of Barbarians feeding intelligence from distant courts. There was no systematic program of marriage alliances to turn enemies into relatives. Western emperors relied on the loyalty of individual military commanders, men who often had their own ambitions. When those commanders turned against the throne, the empire fractured from within. The West also failed to integrate the very barbarians it feared. The Byzantines settled entire tribes within their borders, granting them land and military obligations, turning potential invaders into defenders. The theme system grew out of this practice. The West, by contrast, kept barbarian groups at arm's length, treating them as subjects or enemies, never as partners. When the Western army was finally defeated at Adrianople in 378, the Goths were not absorbed. They remained a separate, hostile presence inside the empire, a wound that never healed. The West's economy was also more brittle. It relied heavily on slave labor and large estates, with a shrinking tax base as the provinces were overrun. The Byzantine economy, though strained, remained diversified and tied to a stable currency. The gold bezant traveled everywhere. Byzantine merchants maintained distant trade links that brought in wealth even during periods of territorial loss. The West never had such a resilient financial system. When the barbarians cut the grain supply from Africa, the Western treasury collapsed. The East survived because it had multiple sources of income, multiple routes of trade, and a government that knew how to manage scarcity. In the end, the Western Roman Empire fell because it could not adapt. It remained rigid in its military thinking, rigid in its diplomacy, rigid in its economy. It treated every crisis as a battle to be won, never as a puzzle to be solved. The Byzantine Empire survived because it treated survival as a continuous process of learning. It changed its tactics when the old ones failed. It accepted humiliating payments as investments. It built relationships with enemies and turned them into allies. It understood that the empire was not a monument to be defended, but a living organism that had to evolve or die. The West died, Byzantium evolved. And that single difference, a way of thinking passed down through generations of emperors and bureaucrats, is what kept the Eastern light burning while the Western flame flickered and vanished. A persistent myth paints Byzantium as a decaying relic, a place of endless court intrigue and slow decline where emperors preferred gold to steel. That image comes from old Western histories, written by people who saw the empire through a biased lens. They called it decadent, weak, and cowardly. They whispered that its diplomats were just clever beggars and that its army was a mercenary rabble. But this picture is a caricature, built on a few dramatic moments of crisis and a deep misunderstanding of how the empire actually worked. The truth is far more impressive. Byzantium was not in constant decline from its beginning. It experienced cycles of collapse and recovery that other civilizations could not survive. In the 7th century, it lost its richest provinces to the Persians and then to the Arab conquests. The empire was reduced to a rump state, its army shattered, its treasury empty. Most kingdoms would have vanished, but within a generation, it had rebuilt, reorganized, and launched counterattacks that reclaimed critical territory. That was not the behavior of a decaying corpse. It was the behavior of a state that knew how to absorb shock and spring back. The Komnenian restoration of the 12th century again proved that the empire could reinvent itself after disaster. And even after the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, the exiled rulers of Nicaea rebuilt a functioning state from nothing, eventually recapturing Constantinople itself. These were not the actions of a weak or cowardly culture. They were the actions of a people who had mastered the art of resilient adaptation. The accusation of cowardice usually comes from those who mistake strategic patience for fear. When a Byzantine emperor chose to pay tribute instead of fight, he was not being weak, he was being rational. He understood that a temporary payment could preserve an army for the battles that truly mattered. He understood that a lost battle could mean a lost province, while a delayed conflict could mean victory later. This was not cowardice. It was a sophisticated calculation of cost and benefit, a habit of mind that valued long-term survival over short-term glory. The modern world can learn from this. We live in an era that often rewards the quick win, the dramatic gesture, the decisive strike. But the Byzantine example shows that the most enduring successes come from a different approach, a patient, adaptive strategy that weighs every option and saves force for the moment when it can make the greatest difference. It is the strategy of the marathon runner, not the sprinter. It is the wisdom of knowing that the enemy who exhausts himself against your walls may eventually collapse from his own effort, leaving you standing. Byzantium did not survive because it was lucky. It survived because it was smart. Its legacy is not the gold or the mosaics alone, but a quiet, practical philosophy of survival, that the best way to win is often to refuse the battle you cannot win and to wait for the one you can. That strategy is what kept the empire alive for 1,000 years. It was not a miracle. It was not a single brilliant emperor or a lucky break. It was a deliberate, flexible, and resource-conscious grand strategy that treated survival as the only victory that mattered. Every decision, every tribute payment, every marriage alliance, every patient retreat, every carefully chosen battle, all of it served one goal: to ensure that Constantinople would see another sunrise. The Byzantines understood that empires die not when they lose a single war, but when they lose the will to continue. And so they built a culture that refused to give up, a system that could bend but never break, a way of thinking that turned weakness into strength and patience into power. When the Ottomans finally breached the walls in 1453, the strategy had run its course. The empire had no more allies to call upon, no more gold to pay, no more armies to field. Every option had been exhausted. The last emperor, Constantine XI, did not flee. He chose to stand with his city, a final act of defiance that echoed the 1,000-year tradition of refusing to surrender. The city fell, but the idea it represented, the idea that survival is a choice, did not die. It lived on in the strategic wisdom that Byzantium passed down to the world. That wisdom is still relevant today. It reminds us that the most enduring victories are often the ones that never make the headlines. They are the quiet decisions to wait, to adapt, to rethink the problem, and to choose the path that keeps you standing for the next round. It is a lesson in patience, humility, and the long view. Now I want to hear from you. After watching this deep dive, what do you think the one strategy truly was that allowed Byzantium to survive for a millennium? Was it diplomacy, the theme system, the walls, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this exploration of historical strategy, please subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next story of resilience and survival. Until then, remember that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to fight.